Next up, this guy's a Howley. Bobby Owens. Pasty skin, freckles, and blonde hair. It's turned kind of Snow White, but this guy rips in every sense of the word. 1957, he was born in Italy. And once that gets out, the frickin' Italians are going to claim him as their own. But he spent some time here on the East Coast, so we're doing that. We're claiming Bobby Owens as our own because he really started the developmental process here on the East Coast. He first surfed up in Atlantic Beach out in Jacksonville back in 64, 65, just getting his head wet. But then he moved to the North Shore of Hawaii. His father was in the military special forces ranger in Green Beret, and he got stationed over in Hawaii, Oahu, and that's where he learned the basics of what turned into be a phenomenal pro career. Let me see, let's gotta skip forward here. In 1970, after those 4 years on the island of Oahu, he moved back to Daytona Beach. He was here for 2 years, and in those 2 years, he won the ESA Boys Division in 1972. He competed in the ESA as a developmental process, and he says a lot of what he learned in that was formulative in his later pro career. Think about this. He never lost an ESA heat up to that championship. He's not a loser. In 72, his family moved back to Hawaii. Bobby was 15 at the time and continued competing in the ESA with immediately good results. He repeatedly would get into the final with the likes of Michael Ho, Larry Burlman, Mark Liddell, Buzzy Kerbach, Dane Kealoha. He was right there in the thick of things with the who's who in the future. These guys were all 15, 16, 17 years old developing. And Bobby Owens, look at this guy. And I talked to him today and I asked him, I said, you're pretty much a Howley. How did you survive in the schools over there? We all have heard the stories. And the fact that he was a surfer, he got harassed one time and one of his friends took care of the problem and said, look, he's one of us, he's a surfer. And he went through 4 years of high school and never got touched. That's rare. Right, Bobby? You're living a charmed life. He turned pro in 1976 and quickly became a competitor to keep your eye on. He finished second in 77 at the Duke Classic, just behind Eddie Aikau. What, if you paid attention, his ascension up into the competitive ranks is extremely fast, and that speaks of one thing, talent. He's a talented surfer. And he fortunately decided to hone his skills at Sunset, and Sunset became his home, eventually living up on the hill overlooking Sunset Beach. He became the first East Coast surf champion to crack the IPS top 16 in 1977. Now, Jeff Crawford got in the top 16, but he wasn't an East Coast champion. Bobby is very proud of that. In 1980, Bobby won the Pro Class Trials at Sunset Beach and followed up with consecutive wins in the 81 Quicksilver Trials at Bells Beach. A few weeks later, the Lightning Bolt Eliminations in Sydney, Australia. And these three contests were the epitome of qualifying into the Pro Tour in Australia. Winning 3 trials events back-to-back was unprecedented. Bobby honed his teeth at Sunset and had an epiphany one day. It was the most vivid moment, dramatic in his surfing career, taking place at Sunset Beach one day in 1984. The surf was 10 feet, strong trade winds and swell out of the west. He was riding a 7.4 George Downing Lightning Bolt and just started making these crazy airdrops and getting the best rides of his life. He was overcome with emotion and had this great sense that the torch had been passed on to him to set a new level of performance at Sunset Beach. and still today, he calls Sunset Beach the most challenging wave in the world because it will test your abilities as a surfer. And Bobby Owens is a champion and a phenomenal surfer at Sunset Beach. He takes photos all the time now. I welcome Bobby Owens.
For that introduction. Aloha, everybody. I'm really excited tonight. It just means the world to me that the guys from Daytona and New Smyrna came out, and it's great to see them all here. Terry Presley, Charlie Baldwin, Bernie Crouch is back there, Ross Pell. I know I'm probably forgetting a few of them there, but anyways, it's great to see you guys. So. Aloha. There we go. You know, a surfer doesn't get to this point on his own merit. So I really wanted to take this occasion tonight to talk about the people that really made a huge impact on me and basically got me to where I am tonight. So the first people I'd really like to talk to is my parents. Janet and Bob Owens. So my parents were just amazing people. They both really embodied the meaning of aloha, and you know, through the years, so many surfers stayed at our house, and there was really a connection between the Florida surfers and our house, regardless of where we lived on Oahu. It might have been the Palisades or Ewa Beach, out to Mililani, all through the 70s and into the 80s. We had a lot of different Florida surfers stay at our house. And so my parents were, you know, they're just really open with their hospitality. And you know, back then, you really depended on staying at people's houses if you were traveling. That's how we made it. There wasn't really a lot of money in the sport. But anyways, I just wanted to mention my parents because in the early days when I was competing, they, you know, your parents were kind of like your sponsors the first 3 or 4 years that I was on the tour. You know, there wasn't, you know, the bigger companies like OP and Lightning Bolt were still getting steam and hadn't really, you know, they weren't there yet in 1976. And so I was just really lucky that I had supportive parents and always kept us by the ocean. And, you know, that really was the difference in 1976, the first year there was an organized tour that I was able to do that. So a lot of personal loans were taken out to get me from one leg to the next, from Australia to South Africa. So I wanted to go back in time. 1970, our family left Hawaii, and we arrived. We drove a red Volkswagen camper van all the way across country. And we pulled up on the shores of Daytona Beach, right down the ramp at Dunlawton. Just imagine this, a bright red Volkswagen camper van with the white pop top loaded with Hawaiian spears on top. And this van pulls up, and we see two surfers off, you know, coming out of the water and approaching us very curiously. And the door opens, and a dog falls out, followed by 3 kids, my brothers, Chris and Gary. And it turned out that the 2 surfers that approached us were Bernie and John Crouch. So, both long hairs of the time. And anyways, that was the beginning of our time in Ponce Inlet, where we resided, and where I started surfing in the ESA. And the very first contest I surfed in, Bernie had joined forces with the Daytona Beach JCs and put on a little contest right in front of the White Orchid Motel. That motel's no longer there anymore. But anyways, that was the first contest that I won. And boy, did that ignite a spark. So that was really the beginning for me. And you know, 50 years later, here I am still friends with Bernie. Still making my boards, and we have this connection called Harold Iggy, and Bernie has really done such a fantastic job in perpetuating what Harold was always trying to accomplish over the years, and that's just making the finest surfboards possible. And so I feel very lucky. Those 2 years in Daytona and surfing in the ESA, we had such a blast. My mom and dad would take turns driving us up and down the coast to all the surfing contests, and eventually 1972 came around and it was time to go to Cape Hatteras for the East Coast Championships, and I won that. And then our whole family went back to Hawaii, and by 1973 we were established back in Hawaii again. And so we lived in different places, but in 1974 in Eva Beach, Charlie Baldwin from New Smyrna Beach came over and stayed with us for a few months. And Charlie was working and surfing, and I was just very fortunate to have him stay with our family, and he became a member of our family. And he would do things like pour my mom a martini after a long day at the office when she came home and stuff like that. And every chance possible, he would drive me out to the North Shore. And then one day, I get choked up, sorry. But one day in the fall of 1974 was when we paddled out at Sunset Beach. And boy, he probably is as surprised as I am, but boy, did that change my life, the day that I paddled out there with Charlie. And I was so lucky to have a mentor like him. And once I got out there, I loved that break. I just, the lineup was gigantic, and there was all these shifting peaks, and it was wild, and the wind was blowing. And I just knew at that point that was the break where I really wanted to push myself. And so that whole fall, Charlie and I just, we drove out and surfed Sunset and all the other North Shore spots that fall. And so that was a time I'll really remember, and I just wanted to tell Bernie and Charlie, thank you for being mentors. And of course, I mentioned Harold Iggy earlier. Hunter was asking me earlier, what was the proudest moment in your surfing career? And of course, all these different scenes just go racing through your mind. There was the year at Bell's in '81, surfing with Simon Anderson, when the thruster was first introduced, and I surfed a single fin in that heat, and it was probably one of the last times that a single fin was going to be surfed in man-on-man competition. So it ended up being that I rode a borrowed board that day that was shaped by Terry Fitzgerald, and I want to just thank Terry Fitzgerald for setting me up with that board that day, and it was just incredible heat. So getting back to that, Harold's boards were amazing. I've always said that his boards were sort of like the Lamborghinis of their time. Like when you saw somebody holding a Harold Iggy board, the way that it was foiled, and just the color designs and everything, they really, really stood out. And one day, when I first returned back to Hawaii in '73 or '74, I was surfing at Makaha, and it was a competition. It was the HSA versus the ESA, and Harold saw me surf that day, and he asked me if I wanted to join his team, which consisted of Guy Pilago and Bird Mahialona and Lynn Boyer at the time, and that was such an honor. And that was getting back to the point I was trying to make earlier, was that, when I look back at that time, that was probably one of my most proud moments, was being able to ride for Harold Iggy. So another guy that really played such a huge role in my career was Mark Warren, Australian Mark Warren. And 1976 was the first year there was a structured tour, and we went down to Australia, and Mark picked me up, and he had this Holden van. It was kind of like a car van, you've probably seen them, but we went straight to Bell's, and in my first contest I placed 7th, and that was the year Jeff Hackman won Bell's in 1976. And Mark coached me all the way through that contest, except to the point where I think he ended up 3rd or 4th in that contest, and he coached me just to the point to where I wouldn't beat him. So, and so, Mark played a huge role in that first trip down to Australia, and I was very, like I said, I was very, very lucky to have those guys all mentor me during that time. So. basically, in my closing thoughts, one of the things I wanted to explain was like when we were living in Ponce Inlet in the early 70s, I remember there was a day where we lived on Old Carriage Road on the north end of Ponce, and there weren't any waves that day, and I walked down to the ocean, and I just sat there, and I felt this really heavy feeling come over me, and it was really a very strong feeling, and that was the bonding with the ocean moment that I had, and it was just like one of those moments where I couldn't really define it at the time, but I just knew something big was kind of happening, and so I just kind of like to leave you on the thought that if you really get in harmony with the ocean, you really never know what the outcome is going to be. She might just let you do something really great. So that's all I want to say. Thank you very much, everybody.